Something just snapped inside the Cleveland Browns' locker room. Not during the game after it, not on the field behind closed doors, and not by some rookie trying to make headlines, but by Myles Garrett, the heart of the Browns' defense, their captain, and now the loudest voice against them. After one humiliating loss to a bottom-ranked Jets team, Garrett didn't hold back. He blasted the coaching staff, took direct aim at head coach Kevin Stefanski, and questioned everything from the game plan to the so-called rebuild. And the wildest part? He did it in front of the entire world. This isn't just frustration. This is a full-blown rebellion inside Cleveland, and it might cost someone their job. Because what started as a few missed plays just became a team-wide crisis. And as the losses pile up, one brutal truth is becoming impossible to ignore. The Browns aren't just falling apart on the field, they're breaking from the inside. They walked into the stadium expecting to dominate. The Browns were supposed to bury the Jets. After all, New York had only managed 2 wins all season. On paper, this wasn't just a winnable game, it was a guaranteed breath of life for a struggling Cleveland team desperate to turn things around. But what happened on that field wasn't just embarrassing. It was a complete collapse. From the first snap, something felt off. The energy wasn't there, the discipline wasn't there, and worst of all, the leadership seemed completely absent. The Browns didn't just lose, they gave the game away. Sloppy mistakes, staggering missed assignments, no urgency, no fire. And the quarterback situation? Brutal. Dillon Gabriel looked like he didn't even belong out there. Sure, he flashed some early game confidence, moving the ball with rhythm on the first couple drives, but the second the Jets figured him out and dialed up the pressure, everything unraveled. He froze in the pocket, missed simple reads, panicked under blitz. 6 sacks in 4 quarters, and let's be honest, it could have been worse. One of the ugliest moments was almost hard to believe. Cedric Tillman absolutely cooked his man with a crisp double move. He had nothing but green grass ahead, wide open, signaling for the ball like it was drawn up just for him. And Dillon overthrew him. Badly. Not inches, yards. The ball didn't just float too far, it looked like it was fired into the stands by mistake. It was the kind of misfire that doesn't just kill a drive, it crushes morale. The stadium crowd went from holding its breath to shaking its head. And the sideline? Dead silent. Everything about that game screamed disaster. And yet, if you looked across the field, it wasn't the Jets imposing their will. They didn't look great, they just capitalized on every mental error Cleveland made. False starts, blown coverages, reckless turnovers. It looked more like a preseason scrimmage than a regular season game that counted. But here's where things got darker. Because once the final whistle blew, that disaster on the field followed the team straight into the locker room. For most teams, a loss like this would be an opportunity to regroup, own the mistakes, rebuild focus, circle the wagons. But in Cleveland, it triggered something else entirely. Myles Garrett, usually the calm and relentless engine of this defense, had seen enough. Everyone expected a quiet, robotic post-game press conference. Instead, they got a grenade. Garrett didn't sugarcoat, didn't waffle. He called out the excuses being fed to the locker room, called out the rebuild label being used to deflect from results. And most shockingly, he called out head coach Kevin Stefanski, directly questioning the leadership, the strategy, and the accountability behind the scenes. The game against the Jets wasn't just another L in the standings. It was the breaking point. And it's easy to see why. Dillon Gabriel, for all his raw potential, looked completely overmatched. His decision-making was slow. His pocket presence evaporated against even basic defensive pressure. It didn't look like a rough outing, it looked like a kid thrown into the deep end with no life vest and no one watching the sidelines. Garrett wasn't lashing out over one Sunday. He was exploding after weeks of watching this team circle the drain and seeing nobody up top doing anything about it. And the worst part? That entire game was winnable. The Browns didn't need a miracle, they just needed execution. Discipline. One decent drive, one big defensive stop. But everything that could go wrong did go wrong and nobody took control. Not Stefanski, not the offense, and not the coaching staff calling the same ineffective plays while the game slipped away. When you look at that Jets game in isolation, it's bad, but when you place it into the bigger picture of Cleveland's season, it's catastrophic, because it showed something far more dangerous than a bad outing. It showed a team spiraling without a clear direction, without strong leadership, and now, without locker room trust. And the man who decided he wasn't going to stay silent anymore? The Browns' most respected player, their captain, their cornerstone. Myles Garrett. And what he did next sent shockwaves through the entire organization. Inside that locker room, there wasn't yelling. There wasn't chaos. Just silence. Cold, heavy silence that told you everything you needed to know. This wasn't a team that lost a hard-fought game. This was a team that handed one away again. And this time, nobody could pretend it was part of the bigger plan. That's when it happened. Myles Garrett stood up. One of the most respected players in the NFL, defensive superstar, the pillar of Cleveland's locker room culture, the guy who usually plays it safe with his words, lets his game do the talking. But this time, he didn't hold anything back. To reporters, he looked calm. Too calm. But every word hit like a gut punch. He didn't rant, he didn't scream, he just spoke truth loud enough for every player and every coach to hear it. Garrett started by questioning the entire philosophy behind the team's direction. He called out the passive mindset, the excuses, and most of all, the dangerously comfortable narrative that this was all part of a rebuild. We keep hearing it's a process, he said, but how long do we call this a rebuild while wasting an entire season? He didn't name names immediately, but no one had to guess who he was talking about. Kevin Stefanski. Because when your captain starts talking about wasted time, lack of urgency, and leadership failures, he's not blaming the water boy, he's pointing the finger right at the man in charge. And he didn't stop there. Garrett made it personal, calling out the culture that's been fermenting around the team. The kind where losing is brushed aside with fancy press conference, buzzwords, and vague promises of improvement. He didn't scream, "Fire Stefanski," but his message wasn't subtle either. "I just want to win," he told reporters. Losing like this over and over again, you either get numb to it or you get p-times-cessed enough to say something. And in that moment, he chose fire. Remember, this is the face of the defense, the guy who should be echoing the coach's message, backing the leadership, setting the example. Instead, he torched the entire narrative Stefanski had been selling since the start of the season. The trust the process speeches? He called them hollow. The rebuild storyline? He said it's wearing thin. The patience message? He made it clear his patience just ran out. It wasn't just frustration. It was a statement. We're done waiting. Put wins on the field or stop pretending like we're building something. And here's the part that made it hit even harder. Garrett didn't walk it back. Not in the press conference, not the next day, not even when reporters doubled back trying to get a softer quote. He stood by every word because they weren't just his. They were everyone's. He just happened to be the only one brave enough to say them out loud. You could feel the shift in the air. Fans lit up social media, flooding timelines with Garrett's quotes, praising him for saying what they'd been thinking for weeks. Talking heads on ESPN and sports radio suddenly dropped the usual coach-speak analysis and locked onto one single question. Did Garrett just declare war on his own coaching staff? And the truth is, kind of. Yeah. Not because he wanted chaos, because he wanted accountability. Because playing at a Pro Bowl level week after week while the team crumbles around you, that wears on any leader. Eventually, something has to give. And now it has. Stefanski was officially on the hot seat. Not because of the Jets game, not even because of the losing record, but because the voice of the team just aired out the dirty laundry on national TV and didn't blink while doing it. This wasn't a blow-up, this was a mutiny. And while the post-game press conference ended, the real storm was just getting started. Because now, it wasn't just about performance on the field. Now, it was about power, leadership, and who the Browns' locker room really believed in. And trust this explosion wasn't the end. It was just the match that lit the fuse. By Monday morning, the whispers had stopped. Now, it was shouting. The tension between Myles Garrett and Kevin Stefanski had officially leaked beyond the walls of the Browns facility, and it hit the media like a wildfire. Garrett's post-game comments weren't just making headlines, they were the headlines on every major sports network. And fans? They weren't divided. They were taking sides, and most weren't siding with the head coach. Social media exploded, with reactions clip after clip of Garrett's interview, spliced with Browns lowlights and captions like, "Finally, someone said it." Support for Garrett was surging, not just because he's a star, but because he said what every frustrated fan and clearly every frustrated player had been thinking. But then, the story evolved. Because Stefanski didn't stay silent either. In his own post-game presser, Stefanski tried to stay calm, tried to stick to the usual coach-speak script. But one quote changed everything. Leadership, especially in the locker room, needs to be consistent, strategic, not emotional. To anyone on the outside, it might have come off like a generic line, but for anyone who's been around this team, it was a clear shot across the bow. Let's break it down. Not emotional. That's Stefanski calling Garrett's passionate outburst a weakness, framing his leadership as reactionary, basically saying, play better before you talk. Sure, Stefanski threw in a half-hearted compliment about Garrett's on-field impact, but it was textbook deflection, a subtle undermining, a political move dressed in poise, and Garrett saw it for what it was. The gloves were off. This wasn't just a comment or two. This was a philosophical collision between your best player and your head coach. Two leaders, two different standards, and now two opposite directions. Behind the scenes, things grew even more unsettled. Reports began to surface that other players were watching closely to see how Stefanski would handle the situation. Some supported Garrett, quietly nodding when asked if they related to what he said. Others kept their heads down, afraid to speak, afraid to choose the wrong side. But that caution wasn't helping. It only made the divide more dangerous. The Browns' locker room, once bonded in chase of a shared goal, was now split down the middle. And while Garrett took the heat, Stefanski tried to spin control. He did more interviews. He repeated the rebuild narrative. He pointed to progress, youth, and development. But something had changed. The public no longer saw him as calm and composed. They saw him as detached. Myles Garrett? He was fire, emotion, honesty. Stefanski? Starting to look cold, calculated, out of touch. And when you're losing games, trust me, perception is everything. Players stopped hiding their frustration at practice. Body language turned defensive. Communication broke down. Veteran leaders who were once quiet started grumbling. Even assistants were reportedly giving players mixed messages about who to rally behind. This was no longer about football. This was about control. And the Browns were rapidly becoming the NFL's latest locker room implosion. The media doubled down, analysts ripping into the Browns for their dysfunction. ESPN, Fox Sports, NFL Network all asking the same questions. Has Stefanski lost the locker room? Is Myles Garrett leading a quiet player mutiny? And how much more chaos can the front office tolerate before someone gets fired? These weren't wild accusations anymore. They were headline segments. Daily sports talk cycles revolved around Cleveland, not because of record-breaking plays or playoff chances, but because of internal collapse. Now, everyone was watching. Every press conference, every injury report, every sideline glare, because what started with one loss to a bad Jets team had triggered a power struggle that was threatening to burn the entire season down. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the cracks inside the locker room began to split wide open. It didn't take long for the cracks to turn into chasms. The Browns weren't just dealing with outside noise anymore. The storm was now inside the building, and nobody seemed to know how to stop it. According to team insiders, the atmosphere during practices had taken a dark turn. Players normally upbeat and locked in were now quiet, distracted, or just straight up disconnected. Drills lost intensity. Communication broke down. Passes were dropped. Assignments blown. Energy gone. One source described it simply: tense. Just tense. Like everyone's walking on eggshells. That's not football. That's a team in emotional freefall. And it wasn't just about performance. This was personal now. Because after Garrett's post-game comments and Stefanski's not-so-subtle jab in response, the locker room didn't just split, it fractured into factions. On one side, players backing Garrett's message. Veterans who'd watched this team underperform year after year, quietly agreeing with every word he said, that this cycle of excuses had become unbearable. On the other side, guys either afraid to speak or still buying into Stefanski's plan, hoping the chaos would pass if they just kept their heads down and stuck to the script. But that silence, it wasn't loyalty. It was fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of losing snaps. Some younger players were reportedly told to stay out of it. Others, seeing where things were headed, began reaching out to their agents just in case. That's no longer a football problem. That's a culture problem. And you could feel it in every room. Meetings became awkward, rigid, full of side-eye. Players stopped joking around. Little things got misinterpreted as disrespect. Coaches, trying to hold it together, suddenly found themselves in damage control mode, just trying to keep guys focused. Worse? Stefanski's response was to circle the wagons even tighter. He began pulling closer to a handful of loyal assistants. Members of the coaching staff noted that communication lines between the head coach and several players had thinned out entirely. One player even said, "He's picking favorites now." Stefanski wasn't acting like a coach trying to fix a crack. He was building walls around it. Meanwhile, Garrett? He didn't back down. Off the field, he leaned into his leadership role, talking to teammates, keeping spirits up, checking in with rookies, making sure no one completely spiraled. But walking that line wasn't easy. Because as much as he was trying to protect the team, everyone knew he was still the reason this circus started. And yet, strangely, it made players respect him more. He owned his words, took the heat, never deflected. And for teammates sick of being told to wait for next season, that honesty felt like a breath of fresh air. The divide wasn't Stefanski versus Garrett anymore. It was stubbornness versus change. Silence versus truth. Status quo versus reality. And the Browns? They were stuck right in the middle. Players who typically stayed neutral, guys known for keeping their heads down, started showing frustration. Body language during games and practices screamed exhaustion. One veteran was reportedly heard saying, "I'm tired of pretending we're building toward anything." Even the media caught wind of the internal damage. Sideline reporters mentioned distant huddles, unengaged eyes, the visible disconnect between Stefanski and several of his top players, not just Garrett. Cameras started catching every grimace, every cold handshake, every awkward press conference pause. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was on tape. And the front office? Watching. Closely. Because there's one thing that makes ownership more nervous than a losing streak. It's losing the locker room. And that's exactly what was happening. What started as frustration had turned to friction. What started as questions about scheme became questions of trust. And questions left unanswered for too long? They turn into decisions. Fast ones. And someone in Cleveland was about to face the consequences. When leaders go quiet in times of chaos, someone else has to step up. And that's exactly what Myles Garrett did. While coach Kevin Stefanski retreated further into isolation, Garrett leaned harder into his role as the emotional core of the team. Not by screaming in meetings or grandstanding in public, but by showing up, speaking truth behind the scenes, and earning trust the old-fashioned way, face-to-face, man-to-man. He met with teammates, not to stir the pot, but to steady the ship, to address the elephant in the room that no one else had the guts to say aloud, "We're not okay. And unless something changes now, it's going to get worse." These weren't shallow pep talks. This was leadership, the kind that isn't written into contracts or drawn up on whiteboards. He wasn't trying to be the coach. But in Stefanski's absence, he became the voice players started to follow. Some teams fracture under that pressure. Some shut down completely when players speak out publicly. But this Browns squad? They started listening. Not just to Garrett's frustration, but to the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was the only one willing to say what everyone else was thinking. But while Garrett stepped forward, Stefanski melted further into the background. The same coach who once preached open communication and emotional intelligence had now gone radio silent in the locker room. According to reports from inside the Browns facility, Stefanski tightened his circle to a few trusted assistants. Players noticed. Some said they hadn't had a single real conversation with their head coach in over a week. That's not leadership, that's survival mode. And it got worse. When pressed by reporters, Stefanski kept repeating the same vague, robotic answers. "We're developing. We're focused on getting better. We trust the process." The same canned statements that now felt completely disconnected from the reality players were living. And while the house was burning, Stefanski was in the corner holding a garden hose, pretending like the fire wasn't real. His refusal to bench Dillon Gabriel was the clearest example. Week after week, Gabriel's performance dipped poor reads, ball security issues, collapsing under pressure, but Stefanski stuck to his script. Growing pains, he called it. Part of the plan, he insisted. But that plan was costing them wins, morale, control, and worst of all, credibility. In any other situation, a player like Garrett might get reprimanded for going public against the organization. But not this time, because Garrett wasn't rebelling, he was rescuing. He wasn't trying to create division. He was trying to stop one from swallowing the team whole, and that was something players could rally around. Still, the deeper Stefanski pulled away, the more obvious it became. He wasn't just losing control. He was quietly giving it up. He was coaching like a man boxed in. Rather than adjust, rather than rally the team around something real, he doubled down, pretending nothing was wrong. He clung to structure, habit, routine. But football's not a spreadsheet. It's war. And in a battle, the general can't turn his back when his soldiers start screaming for orders. Meanwhile, Garrett, the guy who was never supposed to speak up this loudly, was now the emotional anchor of the entire organization. Media began framing him as the people's leader. Players gravitated toward him not because he had all the answers, but because he wasn't pretending anymore. No politics. No PR spin. Just honesty. Passion. Grit. And that shift, it changed everything. Because when your players stop looking toward the coaching staff for answers and start looking at a teammate instead, that's the moment you know the balance of power has shifted. Kevin Stefanski may still have the title. He may still call the plays. But the Browns? They weren't running his locker room anymore. Myles Garrett was. And just when Stefanski thought things couldn't spin further out of his control, the media, or rather the mob, started sharpening their knives. By week 10, Kevin Stefanski wasn't just coaching to win games anymore. He was coaching to survive them. Because as the Browns' performance nosedived, the pressure outside the building went nuclear. And inside, it was already suffocating. Every press conference became a minefield, every sentence dissected, every facial expression spun into breaking news. His once steady voice had morphed into something quieter, shakier, like a guy holding onto the wheel, even though everyone else knew the car was spinning out. And the media? Smelled blood. NFL analysts were no longer questioning scheme or execution. They were openly asking if Stefanski had completely lost the locker room. Talk shows lit up with comparisons. He's turning into the next Matt Rule. It's giving Urban Meyer energy disconnect and denial. Is this just another coach who got too stubborn to see the storm coming? What made it worse was Stefanski's refusal to change course. To him, sticking with Dillon Gabriel was the course. Even after back-to-back brutal outings, even after multiple games with zero offensive rhythm, even after Gabriel's name trended for all the wrong reasons, Stefanski still doubled down. He told the media, "We believe in Dillon. He's got the tools. He's just got to settle in." But no one was buying it anymore. Not the reporters, not the fans. And definitely not the players watching Gabriel flinch through another miserable practice. Let's be honest, Gabriel isn't the villain here. He's raw, under fire, and being put in a near impossible spot. But Stefanski's blind loyalty has turned the quarterback controversy into something much bigger. It became a symbol of everything going wrong in Cleveland. Ignoring obvious problems. Sticking to outdated plans. Choosing ego over results. Players started tuning out. Not just Gabriel, but everything. The game plans, the speeches, the supposed long-term vision. And Garrett? He never said it aloud, but you could feel it. He was done, hoping Stefanski would change. At that point, even he knew the coach wasn't budging. And that's the scariest kind of leadership failure, the kind no one believes in anymore. In one media appearance, Stefanski tried to pivot subtly, throwing shade back at Garrett by saying, "Leadership is about doing, not just talking." That line? Dozens of headlines. Is Stefanski undermining Garrett's leadership? Coach blames star player for chaos he created. It backfired. Badly. Because now, the Browns weren't just the topic of concern. They were the league's favorite train wreck. Even national headlines began picking it apart. Not a rebuild. A meltdown. Is Cleveland about to implode? Kevin Stefanski has officially entered the danger zone. Worse still, rumors leaked from inside the organization. Rumblings of ownership getting nervous, front office executives holding closed-door meetings, contingency plans being discussed, code words, loaded language. Everyone knew what that meant. He wasn't getting fired today. But tomorrow? That was starting to sound possible. And then, the cameras started catching it. Sideline interactions between Stefanski and players growing colder, eyes avoiding contact, coaches arguing subtly through headsets, the body language across the board off. No unity, no urgency, no leadership. The Browns weren't a losing team anymore. They were a crumbling one. And Stefanski, this architect of the Cleveland rebuild, looked like a man trying to hold up a roof while the walls were already gone, still standing, but alone. What made it worse? He had chances to pivot, to adapt, to humble himself, maybe even win the locker room back. But instead, he kept talking about sticking to the plan. A plan that had already failed, a message players had stopped believing, a process that now felt more like delusion than design. And when your best defenders are checking out, and your locker room leader is calling you out publicly, the spiral isn't accidental. It's inevitable. Because in the NFL, there's one rule every veteran knows. You can lose games, but you can't lose the team. And Kevin Stefanski, he lost both. Myles Garrett may have set the locker room on fire, but when the smoke reached the fans, they didn't flinch, they cheered. By now, every Browns fan with a phone had seen the post-game footage. The cold stare in Garrett's eyes, the way he didn't sugarcoat a single word. And most of all, how nothing he said sounded emotional or out of control. It sounded true. And for a city that's endured years of disappointment, letdown, and trust the process reruns, it was the first time in a while someone inside the organization spoke with the same fire as the people watching from the stands. Social media lit up, clip after clip, tweet after tweet. Finally, someone saying what we're all thinking. Garrett for head coach at this point. We're behind 95, all the way. And fans weren't splitting on this one. They rallied behind Garrett like he was the lone warrior in a sinking ship. And then came the memes. Stefanski in Titanic GIFs, photoshopped images of Garrett holding a clipboard, edits of Gabriel throwing a ball into Lake Erie. It was funny, until it wasn't. Because the laughter had an undertone. You could feel it. This wasn't just about a quarterback or a bad Sunday. The fan base had flipped. And once that happens in a city like Cleveland, you don't get them back with podium speeches. Inside the team offices, ownership felt it too. Season ticket holders were calling. Sports radio stations were non-stop carnage. National press had a new Cleveland segment daily. The wording started changing no longer. Is there a problem in the locker room? But now, which side will the Browns front office choose, Stefanski or Garrett? Smart organizations know when to act, and behind the scenes, whispers were growing. Meetings, late-night phone calls, words like contingency and damage control. And most importantly, a growing sense that this can't go on much longer. Cleveland's front office wasn't just watching results, they were watching momentum. And right now, the wave was building hard in Garrett's favor. Sure, he didn't have a whistle or a clipboard, but what he did have was the players' ears, the locker room's respect, the fans' full trust. And when Stefanski tried to take subtle shots at Garrett's emotional leadership, fans weren't just unsympathetic, they turned hostile. The public now saw Stefanski as the guy letting the team fall apart while preaching patience like a broken record. His calm demeanor, once praised his composure, now looked like clueless detachment. Meanwhile, Garrett? Every word burned with the same emotion that fans have worn for decades. He wasn't just a Pro Bowler anymore. He was the voice of an entire franchise screaming for accountability. With every passing day, pressure from the public made the Browns' situation less about football and more about optics. The team's identity, grit, fight, passion was now embodied by Garrett, not the head coach. Even NFL insiders began reporting that executives are split on Stefanski's status. Translation? Ownership is actively discussing replacements. Not at the end of the season. Right, now. Because the truth is, franchises can recover from losses. They can survive QB busts, strategy missteps, even bad PR cycles. But they can't survive a complete fracture between leadership and locker room, not when the entire city knows it's happening. And that's exactly where Cleveland is right now. A star player speaking pure fire. A head coach fumbling for control. A fan base that's made its choice. And an ownership group forced to decide who leads this team into the future. One thing's for sure, Garrett isn't backing down. And Stefanski? He's running out of ground to stand on. The fans are clear. The locker room has spoken. Now it's up to the front office to decide, adapt, or watch it all burn. Time's almost up in Cleveland. This isn't just player versus coach anymore. The controversy has spread beyond the locker room and into every layer of the franchise, top to bottom. And now, the only question left is, who falls first? Because it's not if something breaks. It's when the next game? Massive. One more ugly loss and this powder keg explodes. Reporters are already camping outside the Browns facility, watching for signs of movement. A trade. A benching. A firing. Anything. Cameras track every press conference. Every sideline glance between Garrett and Stefanski becomes a story. Every word is bait for chaos. Inside the locker room, the energy is tense, exhausted. Players are waiting. Not for a speech, for a decision. They want clarity, leadership, direction. But right now, all they see is a standstill. And from ownership's perspective, doing nothing is no longer an option. Because when you have a superstar calling out the coaching staff, public support swinging against your head coach, and teammates quietly choosing sides behind closed doors, you're no longer running a team. You're managing a crisis. Kevin Stefanski says he's focused on football, but it's not just about play calls anymore. It's about control. It's about leadership. And it's about who owns this locker room. Garrett already made his decision. He doesn't care about PR damage. He doesn't care about protocol. He's here to win, and he's not waiting for permission anymore. The trust is broken, the process is dead, and the Browns are running out of time. Ownership is watching everything, evaluating every interaction, listening not just to what players say aloud, but what they don't. The moment this locker room officially splits, there's no salvaging it. And right now, all signs point to one closing truth. A decision is coming. Soon. And when it does, Cleveland won't be whispering anymore. It'll be erupting.